views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect the views of BronxNet or the program underwriters.
Good evening and welcome to BronxTalk. Election day is November 2nd. You know that. Early voting has already begun, and we've got a lot to talk about. We brought in three fantastic journalists, and let's meet them right now because we got a lot to talk about. We're going to talk about what might happen Election day and beyond. So let's start off and say good evening to senior reporter at City and State New York. Always nice to have Jeff Coltin with us. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you.
And the senior reporter editor covering the government, politics, and investigations for City Limits. It is Ese Olumhense. Nice to have you with us.
Thank you for inviting me.
And David Cruz, my longtime friend, because he used to be here at the Norwood News, but now he's an editor at Gothamist and WNYC. Nice to have you back on the program, David.
Thanks for having me.
Let's just jump right in. Everybody knows who's running for office. The mayor's race is Eric Adams versus Curtis Sliwa. Eric, of course, on the blue line, Mr. Sliwa on the red line. I guess Jeff Coltin, there's no surprise there. I mean, we can predict all we want, but Democrats 7-1 in the city of New York. Even if Curtis Sliwa in that debate moved the needle a little bit, he's got to move the needle a lot to win that, right? Do I have that right?
Yeah, the bigger question is really how much will Eric Adams win by? The margin of victory is what I'm going to be watching, and also the voter turnout. We've seen historic voter turnout over the past few elections, really, both in 2021 Democratic primary and then all the elections before it, kind of the Trump bump. So it'll be interesting to see if that continues, even though the races, the most of the races on the ballot on election day are not going to be that competitive in this heavily Democratic city and in this extremely Democratic borough of the Bronx.
It's very interesting that you talk about a voter turnout. I hadn't really thought of that as being something to watch. Of course, Curtis Sliwa denounced Donald Trump, so he wasn't even a Trump candidate. That's not really on the table. The issue that whoever wrote the profile of Curtis Sliwa in City and State New York correctly pointed out, the issue, that was you? Okay, good job.
Yeah.
The issue that Curtis Sliwa, I guess from his perspective, appropriately wanted to highlight was crime. Very hard to become the crime-fighting candidate against a former police officer. So let's just talk about crime. How do you evaluate Eric Adams' approach to crime? He's talking about a strong police force, but maybe a more moderated one in how it treats the public, a fairer police force. What do you think? That's for Jeff. Let's finish with Jeff, and then we'll go around the room. Everybody's going to have to weigh in on it. So start with you, Jeff, and we'll follow up there.
Well, sure. I mean, look, Eric Adams, even from the beginning of the Democratic primary, kind of owned the crime area because he is a former cop. Of course, Adams was very interesting in that way that, yes, former police officer, but also a longtime critic of the New York City Police Department, somebody who was not afraid to stand up and criticize racism in the police department, how things were done. And so Adams is basically able to play, quote unquote, both sides of the police community divide there. And yes, even though Curtis Sliwa has been known as a vigilante crime fighter for the past 42 years, he just can't compete with Eric Adams on this issue because Adams has, like I said, everything covered. So Sliwa can be talking about crime in New York City, and it is a hot topic, even though the crime rate is nowhere near historic highs. Adams has owned that issue, and Sliwa just doesn't have a lot of ground to make up there. And I don't think he's able to convince voters that he is the correct candidate if you care about that issue.
Especially when crime fighting and the behavior of the police force, certainly in the borough of the Bronx, is right at the top of people's lists. Ese, you've been covering the Bronx for a long time. And I'm curious to what you think about the phrase defund the police, because it's become a catch-all. I believe it was a mistake, because if you want to reapportion some of those funds for preventative opportunities, like with community centers or other things, in a way, it's defunding the police, but it really is a way of fighting crime. So let's talk about that notion of defund the police. Gave Curtis Sliwa easy, advantage by saying, oh, he's going to defund the police. Of course, Eric Adams says he doesn't. Let's start with that phrase and then talk about what you think Eric Adams will do that will help fight crime in the city of New York, assuming he is elected, of course.
Right. I think it's a great question. I mean, crime is something that during the primary was top of mind for a lot of people. They're worried about shootings. They're worried about violence in the community. I will say I hadn't heard anyone in the neighborhoods that I was in on primary day and afterward embrace the defund the police position. I think it's something that's not as popular with the folks who do actually vote than perhaps folks on social media or on Twitter might lead you to believe. I think it's something that's still, when we talk about crime and safety, particularly for the population of voters, older folks who are going out to the polls and will be going out to the polls, starting with Saturday when early voting starts and through Tuesday, that's going to be something that they really care about. They care, one, about how, the next mayor will lead the police department, but also how they will feel in their communities. Will they be safe? Will there be resources that kind of offset, some of the reductions that we've seen in the past with access to services and programming for our youth?
Ese, do you believe, just switching gears a little bit, because the criticism of certainly Curtis Sliwa has leveled it, and frankly, I've heard it from many Bronx progressives, that Eric Adams spends a little too much time with elites, that he's developer friendly, and this takes him off the far left spectrum, so to speak. Do you see that as a concern? Do you think voters will perceive that and say, you know what, we don't really like this guy?
I don't think it's as mainstream as perhaps, Mr. Sliwa, would want you to believe. He's criticized Eric Adams for, quote, raising the roof and hobnobbing with elites and TikTokers and the Kardashians and so forth. I don't think that's stuff that most people really, it makes for great moments in a debate setting, but I don't think that's stuff that either drives people to the polls or drives them away from a particular candidate. And I think it's important. One of the things, or one of the moments where I felt like Eric Adams really fell short last night was during the conversation of putting empty office buildings downtown. Eric Adams says we need to make New York City more business friendly. We have this, adversarial approach to business, and that needs to change. But we got a really strong moment from Curtis Sliwa in his response saying, do we turn Hudson Yards, being as empty as it is, into mausoleums, or do we repurpose the space, and develop more affordable housing? I thought that was a really strong point for someone who otherwise has a platform that's really thin on subjects beyond crime and safety.
David Cruz, let's bring you into the dialogue here. You've been covering development, certainly in the Bronx, for a number of years. Talk a little bit about Eric Adams, and assuming he is elected mayor, how does he see development? Is he too close to developers? I know there are, again, people in the Bronx very concerned that, and we're going to bring Ese back into it because she wrote an expansive piece about rezoning. How do you see development under Eric Adams?
Well, I kind of feel that Eric Adams definitely he's had no qualms about saying that he's essentially a friend to real estate. I mean, he feels that is sort of is tied to his overall agenda of wanting to sort of like kickstart the economy again. And I think he constantly says you can't really have, you can't really have or move the economy forward without sort of like being at least amenable to what real estate wants. So I think that there is definitely he's definitely has a preference to being the kind of a mayor who is a little bit more of a champion for for real estate.
So I guess, Dave, I guess what I'm really asking, do Bronxites concerned about gentrification have a concern now and say, well, wait a minute, for example, the lower section of the Southwest Bronx being developed, many people being displaced. We're going to get to Ese in a second about her piece on rezoning. Do you see more of those kinds of rezonings that could potentially displace but bring in business and other types of economic strata into the Bronx?
Yeah, but I do want to emphasize that he does have another plan to try and convert hotels into affordable housing units. And
although he exempted Manhattan from that, I thought that was fascinating. I mean, we have no hotels here that can be converted.
Right. I think his overall argument was that he believes that the hotels that are in Manhattan will come back to what they were intended for, whereas like some of the hotels he says he felt like they were intended to be built for shelters in the long run. But he essentially is trying to balance this idea of like rezonings, although he wants there to be rezonings where like in places that traditionally have not been touched by the de Blasio administration, mostly wealthier sections of the city. So
boy, we would talk about Throg's Neck. I wonder how that's going to play, which has an ongoing battle right now.
Right.
Let's go to Ese to just talk a little bit about this whole idea of rezoning. How do you anticipate, again, if he is elected, that an Eric Adams mayoralty would approach rezonings? Are we going to find another neighborhood that is offered up for the same kind of rezoning that we got on Jerome Avenue?
I mean, David, I think, is right in saying that Eric Adams is someone who wants to change development, but I don't think he'll break, dramatically with what we've seen over the last several years. The story that we published this week at City Limits, it's the first in a series on the impact of rezonings, was about the Jerome Avenue rezoning in the Bronx. The city had, close to 60 points of agreement with the community in 2018 when they passed that rezoning. And we can see ultimately, from looking at records, looking at data, and speaking with members of the community, that many of those promises, or some I should say, have not been fulfilled in the ways that the city said, that they would over the last few years. I know that that's a sore point for a lot of people. We've seen a lot of energy at the community level around reforming the Uniform Land Use Review Procedure, known as ULURP fondly. This is the set of standards and rules by which the city makes land use decisions and changes. So we know that community members somewhat resent the kind of developer-initiated, way that rezonings kind of take place now. We're seeing this in Throg's Neck, where a developer approached the Department of City Planning and asked to upzone a part of, I believe it was Bruckner Boulevard. So I think we're going to see more of this. I think the interesting thing about the Bronx, and what I'd really like to drill home, is that over the years, we've seen Williamsburg rezoned. We've seen different parts of the city, Brooklyn and Queens and Manhattan rezoned. And we've kind of seen all these refugees, they were priced out of Brooklyn, priced out of Queens, priced out of Washington Heights, end up in the Bronx. I guess my question for the next mayor would be, what happens when those refugees from all of those different boroughs get priced out of the last affordable, borough we have left in New York City? Where do they go, and how does that affect our economy?
Those are great questions. Of course, we will all be here after January 1st and find out. Let's get to the politically charged question of vaccine mandates, and who better to talk about that than Jeff Coltin, who deals with these on not only the city but the state level as well. So there's a lot of difference of opinion now between candidates, and then after that, we're going to talk about the new city council and what that might mean. But Jeff, why don't you just talk a little bit about where the two mayoral candidates stand and what you think the effect of the current regulations are going to be on the city? Will New Yorkers accept it, or will there be enough pushback to say, you know what, maybe we ought to back off?
I'll say that Eric Adams is lucky. He is lucky that he is presumably going to be the next mayor, and the current mayor, Bill de Blasio, is taking all the heat right now for vaccine mandates. We just saw a soon-to-be all city workers are going to have to get a vaccine and not be able to even test out of it and get the weekly test instead. That includes, cops and firefighters, which have very relatively low rates of vaccination. So de Blasio is pushing that through, and Eric Adams and Curtis Lewa, for that matter, just get to kind of sit back and say, okay, well, let that happen. Eric Adams did open up a discussion this week by saying that if the FDA approves COVID-19 vaccines, that he would be open to putting a mandate on all New York City public school students, that they would all have to get the COVID-19 vaccine if the FDA approves it. So that could be a looming discussion, a looming battle with some folks that don't like the vaccine mandates. But for now, we're seeing Bill de Blasio kind of take some of the heat and Eric Adams stay out of it. And look, what will happen with this mandate for all city workers? Not much. There's been
we have actually
sectors.
We have actually done better. I mean, I was looking at some of the numbers. 87% of the police force is vaccinated. That's very hopeful. 60% of the fire and EMS forces are vaccinated. That's okay. I don't think anybody in the city of New York can afford to lose either police coverage or fire coverage over vaccines or anything else. We're going to go around the room. Let's talk about the new city council. So let's see. Eric Dinowitz is being challenged by Kevin Pasmino, and that's in the 11th council district. And in the 13th, Marjorie Velasquez is being challenged by Alexander Michi. Both of those areas, we talk about, let's say, the Northwest Bronx and Riverdale and the East Bronx over there in Throgs Neck, do have pockets of Republican voters. Any chance, any effect, or is they're just going to, this is for you, Jeff Coltin, nothing to say, right? You just move on.
I don't see either of these races as being competitive. It's, the Democrats, Dinowitz and Velasquez, might win by less than some of their colleagues in other parts of the city, but I think they're both going to win very comfortably and can pretty much assume that they're going to be representing those districts come 2022. I mean, Dinowitz is already in.
The other thing that is fascinating about this year, let appropriately start with Ese Olumhense about, is the fact that we are about to have a women majority city council, and many of those new elected people will be from the Bronx. I'm just curious about, assuming this happens, and certainly the numbers will show that it probably is going to happen. I'm just curious about the effect of that. How does that affect legislation, the way that communities are covered, or is it simply, gender equality? Women are now in, and they're going to handle things, and their priorities will be similar to, politically equivalent male council members. What do you think?
I mean, as a woman,
That's why I'm asking you first. We're not shy here. We're in the Bronx.
Of course, to ascribe, too much to, women entering office. They may be just like every other, New York City politician we've seen at the council level. I'm looking, or I will be looking at, whether things get accomplished around maternal mortality or universal childcare. These are things or subjects where momentum has really been building in the last few years. I think at the borough president level, we'll see, Vanessa Gibson, of course, go from the council to representing the entire borough as borough president. We'll also have other borough presidents of color in Brooklyn, Antonio Reynoso, who was a council member, and Donovan Richards in Queens. So I think it's an interesting time in New York City, in terms of representation for women, for folks of color, and members of LGBT communities. There are also a number of queer lawmakers who will probably be elected to the council after the general election. I think it's just an interesting moment. It remains to be seen how this impacts our politics, hopefully in a good way, but I think too early to tell.
David Cruz, you've been covering Bronx politics for a long time. Vanessa Gibson, prospectively, I mean, there is a Republican challenger, but to be honest, she didn't even want to appear on TV when we gave her the opportunity to. So I think it's a pretty good bet that Vanessa Gibson will become the 13th borough president of the Bronx, the first woman. David Cruz, can Vanessa Gibson have real effect. We've been through this a million times. They have no legislative power. What influence can a borough president have, and what might you expect from Vanessa Gibson as she takes control? I have to tell you, I think she's touched all the right buttons in her campaign. I'm just curious what you think. Can she do anything, or is it really going to be up to the council and state legislatures?
Yeah, I think obviously any borough president, they have to bank on their relationships with the council members and also with state legislators, and she's happened to have both. I mean, she was an assemblywoman. She was now currently a council member, and her understanding of how both of these chambers work, I think, will be helpful for her. And I think also just we kind of do know that the position itself is a bit of a figurehead role. So her job will essentially have to be to use the pulpit to amplify these issues that have been impacting the borough. I mean, I kind of think a lot about like how she'll likely take a couple pages from Ruben Diaz Jr. and just really try and sell the Bronx as much as she can. What I find interesting too is that she's not, she's kind of like already like embraced this idea that she's not in favor of this defund the police movement. That's just something that's not within her, she
was the chair of the public safety committee in the city council, so she understands that entire dynamic,
right? And it's a complicated dynamic, and so like she obviously doesn't necessarily want to deal with that, within that realm. But I just find her to be a little bit more of a, kind of like a bit of a mainline Democrat. But she's now in the history books as the first Black borough president and a woman.
She will be in the history books. Let's be clear.
It's a foregone conclusion at this point.
I know.
I did want to mention one point too that one political consultant told me is that they just don't see Curtis Sliwa able to just bring out enough Republicans to really help move the needle here. So that's why a lot of us political journalists, yes, we want to not necessarily prognosticate, but the numbers are essentially there. Just the math just not seeming in Sliwa's favor.
It certainly is hard to avoid. One of the things that, frankly, we talk about, I've been doing debates and we're talking about all the candidates. I really didn't think about the proposals that are on the ballot. So, Jeff Coltin, let's start with you. There are 5 of them. Let's see, redistricting, changing the redistricting guidelines, creating this one. Maybe we'll start with this, Jeff. We don't have time to do all of them. But this notion of creating a constitutional right to the environment, for clean air, clean water, and healthful environment. That's I hate to pun and use that's a sea change, but that's a really interesting thing for Bronxites who are concerned about environmental justice. They can then say, if we're being infringed, not only is, there may be some ULURP consideration that Ese mentioned earlier, but there could be a constitutional issue. What do you think of that? Is that going to fly, here in New York? And what is the effect then in Albany and throughout the state? Good question, right?
I have not followed the ballot proposals closely, so I'm speaking from a place of ignorance here. But I can say broadly that if something is on the ballot, is a ballot proposal in this heavily Democratic state, there is a really good chance that it's going to pass. Most people say yes, 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 unless there's a strong movement against it. And I haven't seen that. I haven't seen much of a movement against these proposals. So I would expect all of them to pass. And I guess for that one specifically about the constitutional right to the environment, the question that comes to mind is this just posturing, or is there actually going to be something behind
some effect? Yeah.
My initial thought is it's just posturing by politicians.
Put
it on the ballot.
It could be, and to me, a public awareness of the importance of environmental issues right now is not the worst thing. I mean, you can complain about the posturing. I kind of like the idea. Let's just talk about voting then. Ese Olumhense. Let's see. The proposal 3 authorizes same-day voter registration. And proposal 4 authorizes no excuse absentee voting. So if you just want an absentee ballot, you can get one. Ese, are these needed reforms, you think, for the city of New York?
I think there's certainly, and something I want to talk up is that the New York City Campaign Finance Board has a really, really good looking voter guide that explains these ballot proposals in greater detail, than the 3 of us could get through today. But you can see kind of the pro arguments and the con arguments. Regular folks, just like all of us, weigh in and leave comments about whether they are for or against an issue. So one of there was less disagreement about the clean air, clean water, and environmental rights that folks may have under this new ballot proposal. But one of two of the proposals that drew the most kind of criticism were the proposals on same-day registration and no excuse absentee ballots. People are concerned about voter fraud. There are lots of comments about if we have same-day, voting, it doesn't give the Board of Elections enough time to really make their way, through the rolls and make sure things are above board. We know there's been a lot of concern and chatter around the operations of the Board of Election, of course. But also I think that there is, concern over the no excuse absentee process for the same reason, or no excuse absentee proposal for the same reason, because people feel that it would make the state vulnerable to fraud, particular voter fraud, particularly at a time when there is less trust than usual in our democracy.
We got about 30 seconds for each of you to do the final comments. David Cruz, what's the biggest thing? I mean, Jeff Coltin talked about turnout as being a very big issue for him. What's the biggest thing for you as you look toward Tuesday, November 2nd?
Well, it's funny you mentioned the ballot proposals, because Gothamist and WNYC, we've written an entire rundown of these ballot proposals, and I would say that they're really important, only because there are serious implications for each of these 5 ballots. Specifically, I think, as you were mentioning, proposal number 2, because it would give the courts even greater power in deciding, whether or not these environmental projects can move ahead, because the language is so simplistic. So, there will be case law, I think, because of this constitutional amendment. So ballot proposals.
That's fascinating. All right. Jeff Coltin, is there a surprise out there or no surprises as we get to November 2nd on Election Day? I mean, what aside from turnout, I mean, that's really your main thing?
Yeah, look, all the interesting races are happening outside the Bronx, I would say. There's a few contested city council races. And of course, a lot of New Yorkers are looking to Buffalo. The Buffalo mayoral race is very interesting, where you've got Byron Brown, the incumbent, trying to do a write-in campaign against socialist India Walton. But so, I guess I would say for all Bronxites who care about politics, maybe read some news from outside the borough on November 2nd,
well,
see what's going around.
But maybe we'll just urge them to get out and vote. It's really important to do that, because if you show numbers, that, of course, shows strength. Ese, final word from you. Do you got anything out there that you haven't mentioned that you want to mention?
Something I think is super interesting. Recently, I did a story on this Queens Council race. It's the race for the last seat that the Queens GOP controls, one of 3 Republican seats in the city council. And I saw that the number of Republicans in the Bronx has increased between November 2016 and November 2020. So in the Trump years, we saw this interesting increase. It's not particularly big, but I think, it's something to,
keep our eyes on.
Yeah, exactly. And also, the underlying message, if you can hear my voice right now, vote. Vote for the ballot proposals. Look at Gothamist's website for those resources. But definitely make your voice heard.
We got to run. David Cruz from Gothamist and WNYC. Thank you. Ese Olumhense from City Limits. Thank you. And Jeff Coltin, you're down there at City Hall, right? Thank you so much for joining us from City and State New York. And that's it. We'll see you next week. Make sure you get out and vote, and have a good night.